Okay, it's just turned midday here in Stockholm, so I can properly say good afternoon to you all who are here with us in person, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening if you are joining us online. For those of you who are here in person, you'll be able to hear everybody through the headphones and the connecting box to get the infrared. Don't put it in your pocket because then the signal gets broken, but just keep it out and then you'll be able to hear everything. And we do that because there's other discussions going on, so it'll allow for a clear set of communications. So I am delighted to welcome you to this discussion called Driving Accountability Through Scope 3 Transparency. So for those of you who know what this is about, you know, yeah, that is a really tough topic, and that's why we need to talk about it. For those of you who don't quite know what that means, let me try and set the scene. And I'll take a step back and I will give a shout out to our dear friends at the Swedish Ministry of Environment and Climate who instigated the Stockholm Action Agenda with us, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the Stockholm Environment Institute. And their ask from the Swedish hosts of this major international summit was quite simple. Can we mobilize our good friends and members from across the WBCSD network and look at challenges that are being faced in terms of sustainability in 6 global value chains? Food and agriculture, travel and tourism, construction, fashion, mobility, and can we take a look at those value chains with our members and our companies and other experts and pinpoint what are the major roadblocks to scaling up transformation, sustainability in those value chains? The results of that effort, which was a major sprint through the spring, we had about 70 stakeholders involved, can be found through your smartphone if you point it at the screen here and download that QR code. If you do that, you'll get straight to the Stockholm Action Agenda. And you will see in that Stockholm Action Agenda a couple of very key insights. We've just come from the main plenary stage explaining this action agenda to the governments of the world represented by their environment and climate ministers here in Stockholm. There are 3 key insights. First of all, that around the world, particularly since the Paris Climate Agreement and also the COP in Glasgow, COP26, which happened last November, there's been a burst of business activity and activity from the financial community. There are coalitions and collaborations and initiatives in multiple sectors on multiple topics, and they are so important and have given so much momentum and got the economy involved in tackling the climate crisis and increasingly into climate and nature and increasingly into climate and social issues in terms of tackling inequality. These 3 big imperatives. If we think about the climate crisis, it's been so important to have that mobilization of effort. However, the second key insight is that there are just only so far that these coalitions and collaborations can go. They're doing an awful lot, but according to the IPCC, we have just 8 years to get on track to have a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. A 45% reduction in 8 years against a business as usual curve of a 23% increase. So that is an enormous challenge. There's so much data and evidence and experience and capacity building that is happening in this business and financial action agenda, but there's a bump starting to happen. And the bump is, okay, folks from government, okay, folks from the international community, we are identifying now key roadblocks that need to be undone to allow us to get to scale in this space. You'll see in the action agenda 3 big areas for that. One is around a circularity protocol. There are so many excellent activities going on in advancing the circular economy, from materials innovation to process efficiency to not thinking about waste but end of first use. But there are so many policy hurdles and barriers in terms of transporting end of first use materials across boundaries, harmonizing standards, harmonizing definitions, that to lift above and have a protocol that just finds the 5 or 6 roadblocks that need to be overcome we could be away. And I'm pleased to say that that is generating a lot of interest amongst our international and governmental friends. Second, skills and capacity building. Not just the skills that we need as we move from a 20th century economy to a 21st century economy, from a brown and fossil-based economy to a green and innovation-based economy. Not just that transition, but also skills and capacity within the corporate community to understand the fast-moving nature of the sustainability transformation. What does it mean now in terms of fiduciary duty within a company? Is it just maximizing return every quarter in terms of profit for shareholder? Is it just discounted cash flow? We know not now, of course, that there are many other things we need to be taking account of. But how do we build that muscle to have the corporate world understanding that and attacking it like champions are already at the moment? And not just within the enterprise management, but collaboration across value chains, so that there's a muscle to be able to lean out and work with others as a natural instinct to create this transformation. And then the third area, accountability and transparency. For those who are already moving fast in the space, particularly from the business and financial community, a space where everybody can see what is going on, easy to find, easy to reference, perhaps globally, perhaps by region, perhaps by sector, and then down to individuals. But then any citizen, any policymaker can ask, okay, so we've mobilized a lot of this effort. How is it going? How is it going against science-based targets? So those are the three key areas in the Stockholm Action Agenda, which, as I say, I'm very, very pleased with the traction it's getting. And that's why this discussion now is absolutely so important. For those of you who know the agenda, you'll know that across those value chains in the climate action space, the Scope 3 challenge, whether upstream of suppliers or downstream of all of their customers, is a big part of the nut to crack to have that 45% reduction in emissions by 2030. You will know that it requires a mindset change to work with other stakeholders along a value chain. You will know that it will require a bravery of collaboration, a sharing of data, a sharing of information, which goes beyond where some of these action coalitions have already stepped. You will know that it's a horrendous task to try and measure apples to apples or pairs to pairs of different data sets and different complexities and different operating platforms and sharing data and what can be shared and what cannot be shared. But we also all know it has to happen. It has to happen if we're going to meet that 45% reduction in emissions by 2030. We need that transparency and we need that accountability, and we need it across the whole of the value chain and across not just shortly, who have seen this and are championing this and are leaning in, are willing to take the risk as the first movers and share data, share information, work on collaboration across upstream supply chains and get this ball rolling. Why on earth does this matter? Imagine if it's 2030 and if you're lucky enough to live in a richer country, you might have a supermarket with all the kind of products that you need. From an emerging economy perspective, you might be able to get access to products increasingly online or indeed in a new form of retail service. But imagine that you could go in to that supermarket or retail or online, and you all probably by 2030 will have at least 4G, if not, because the digital revolution is driving like crazy. You could go in and you could find a product and you could go, okay, let me check the provenance of that product. And with a QR code like the one you can see here for the action agenda, it'll give you clear, crisp information about the whole value chain implication of that product, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Changes the market. Oh, that's interesting, because those suppliers that this company is using for that product are really, really good at keeping their emissions down, are really, really progressive. Oh, I think I'll go in that direction. The market will start then to determine where we allocate our choices, where investors will allocate their resources, and where the cheaper costs of capital will come from the marketplace to those companies that are pushing this agenda hardest and fastest. So we start to transform the system. It's as simple and as complicated as that, but we have to do it. There is no choice if we're serious about tackling Scope 3 emissions to meet that 45% reduction in climate change. And it cannot be done by somebody just sitting in an office in the public sector saying, here's the regulation. Because there's an awful lot of stuff to work out about changing that behavior, identifying what the data is, finding out ways to share that data, figuring out how to be collaborative across value chains. It's got to start with a leap of faith and with an experimentation that says, okay, this seems to be the direction of travel that we're going in. That's why it's the coolest discussion that you'll have in these 3 days here at Stockholm Plus 50. I cannot tell you how exciting it is to be close and involved in these discussions. It's just brilliant. You know, when you are in this career and you think, yeah, is it really going to make it? Watch and listen and engage, because this one is a real reveal about how we're going to crack this Scope 3 nut. So with that kind of overview and introduction, I'm delighted to hand on to what will be a very, very informative panel discussion. But to lead us through it is the architect and curator and shepherd and general brains of the show, working with our wonderful company members who's steering and ideating this piece of work, Anna Stanley, who's the Director of Climate Action at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Anna, thank you so much. And I leave this in your safe and wonderful hands to guide us through the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you to Dominic, and thank you for those very, very, very warm words of welcome. And welcome to all of you here today as well. I am joined by an excellent panel to discuss this topic in detail. We have some business voices on the ground, but we also have some policymakers online. So please join me in welcoming my panel. Online, we have Michele Galatola, Senior Policy Officer at the European Commission. And in the room, we have Keivan Macedo, Sustainability Director at Natura, as well as John Cornerope-Bang, who is the Senior Vice President of Sustainability Transformations at Stora Enso. So welcome. Right, so Dominic has obviously really provided a great insight into kind of the excitement and the game-changing nature of what emissions transparency can do for us. Maybe let me start with the companies here on the ground and ask the two of you, do you kind of also feel like you're not going fast enough? Are companies, where are companies at today versus where they have to go? And then we're going to talk a little bit about how we can actually maybe, speed up the progress. But yeah, Kevin, maybe to start with you.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for the invitation to be part of the panel. Yeah, I think that the response, to be completely honest, yes, I think that we are lacking a little bit to speed up this process. I think that part of the explanation, as Dominic was introducing, that we are still comparing apples to pear, which means that sometimes we can have access to the data, but of course, maybe the data that we have access is not the one that we can compare with the things that we want to see. So we are still missing a common framework and a common understanding. What we have seen so far is that we increase the awareness of our supply chain, so they are aware about a measurement of their carbon emissions, but so far we are still struggling a little bit how we can try to standardize this process.
And John, coming to you, do you agree? Do you think progress is fast enough, or do you think there's still a lot to be done?
Well, I think that's quite an easy question to answer, and of course progress is not happening fast enough. I think from our own side in Stora Enso, we made a new science-based target last year to replace the first we had, and I think what we did with that was to have our ambition high enough. It's a 1.5 degree aligned target, and it includes, of course, Scope 3, and we went, I think, pretty aggressive on Scope 3 because we have a target of reducing Scope 3 by 50% in 8 years' time, absolute, so including all our growth. So that there, I think we at least we're reaching to the level of ambition that is needed. So it's the right level of ambition. Are we moving fast enough towards this? No, we're not. We need to accelerate. I mean, I think everybody needs to accelerate. We need to accelerate. But there are a range of, I think, barriers around that, externally and internally, which are interesting to discuss. I think just one thing here for a beginning that I would like to mention is, and it links to Dominic's last point about the QR codes and the transparency in the value chain for the consumer. this kind of ambition level, 50% in 8 years' time in your entire value chain reduction, requires real transformation of how you do things. And that requires you to have a different approach to how you work with sustainability. And therefore, any system and any data system that we're creating needs to cater for two things. Still, let's say the classical one, which is the corporate level, and it's a value chain level. That's real, and that's what we have done, and that's what you find in my title. That's what I try to add in Stora Enso, to say we now need to focus at product level. So our 250 ambition is not about what Stora Enso is in 250. It's about our product portfolio. So 100% products portfolio, a portfolio with 100% products being regenerative, being carbon positive, being biodiversity positive. So it's the product level, and the product level requires value chains, and it requires, to do any transformation there, you need to be able to commercialize the benefit, the attribute, the sustainability attributes of the products. And that's what Dominic talked about in the end. And that's where we need completely different. First of all, we need real data. You can't use databases, because if you want to commercialize something, you need to be able to differentiate. So it doesn't matter if you just have average numbers. So you need real data, and you need to have unique identity of all the attributes on the products. So therefore, and I'll end now my first intervention, but it points to this need to add a product focus on sustainability work, and to focus a lot of the work on the digitization part of this.
I really like what you're saying there, and I think it leads us very nicely to Michaela, who's online, because you're talking about the product level data. Michaela, you obviously lead some of the work around the product environmental footprint that the European Union is introducing. Can you maybe share a little bit from your side what you think are the key pieces of the puzzle still missing, and maybe also what role policymakers actually play in this? Because coming back to what Dominic said, I think to me in the work I do, collaboration across businesses, across policymakers, across disclosure bodies, across really everyone in the ecosystem is really, really key. So yeah, Michaela, would love to hear your insights.
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for having me in this important panel to discuss these key elements. I mean, it's important. I would also like to build on what Dominic said, and also what John mentioned. It's important to stress that we are running out of time. We must not allow that today dramatic emergencies divert too much of our attention from and our focus on the survival challenge that we have, and that is related to the climate change. We are kind of suffering of a chicken and egg dilemma, because we are missing hard policies due to the lack of data, as Dominic, as John was saying, and also due to perceived methodological complexity. And I stress the word perceived on one side. And on the other side, industry is not producing reliable data due to lack of incentives and sufficient pressure from the regulatory viewpoint. So why I think it's for example interesting when John says we cannot use database, we cannot rely on secondary data. I mean, I understand where he's coming from, and that is probably an indicator of what I may call the regulatory failure, in the sense that my scope 1 emissions are your scope 3 emissions. So if there was a more consistent regulatory framework, not only Europe, but also over the world, about requiring scope 1 emissions to all manufacturers, or the most relevant ones, then we would have solved already by now the problem of the databases and the scope 3 emissions to some extent. So I'm saying that because what we are doing in Europe, and what is happening also in other parts of the world, that is moving from the generic declaration to some more fact-based legislations. This can only work if it will rely on international agreements among the willings to establish common accounting methods, for example, to establish data exchange protocols, to establish incentive schemes that might lead and support lead markets. So there is a lot of room for policymakers. But we cannot work alone. It cannot be top-down based measures, but we need to work with the willings, with the industries, in order to create this path towards development that is absolutely essential.
That is definitely music to my ears to hear you say that, Michele. Keivan, we've spoken a little bit about some of the barriers. What are some of the things that you know, in Natura that you're facing, specific examples, maybe where you feel we need to work on this specific challenge to actually unlock transparency?
Yeah, I think that in our case, one of the challenges that we face, just to give a little bit sensibility to the audience, we have our scope 3 represent 98% of our total emissions, which means that basically whenever we assume any kind of commitments, we need to address these through our value chain. So I think that as I was highlighting a little bit in the first intervention, that we need to guarantee that whenever we ask the data for the suppliers, they are going to send the data that we can compare from one supplier to the other one. And although, and let me tell you this short story, because Natura has been measured their carbon emissions on scope 3 since 2007. And by that time, we need to hire an external environmental consultants to go to the suppliers and measure their emissions. I think that what we have changed, the reality is that in the last few years, if we ask the suppliers, they are going to release their data. But then when we are going to compare the scope and the boundaries that they are considered are totally different. And that is the challenge that we are facing, how we can try to harmonize, because by the end, once they are disclosing the same number for all their clients, they do not want to change. In some of the occasions, because they understand if I change a little bit, I'm going to lose a little bit my competitiveness that I have. But in the other hand, they need to be fair. We need to be equal, because otherwise we are not going to have a fairness in the process. But more than that, we cannot identify what are the sources that we need to address. And that is the major challenge that we have. The other point to highlight is that what we have seen is that some of the suppliers has been already shifting their process. But the point is that they are just doing in one of their manufacturing facilities. They are not spread this globally, which means that in some of the cases we have local sources in Brazil, but now if you want to have a renewable and a greener process, we need to supply from Germany if we're talking about the same suppliers. So then part of this benefit is going to be lost whenever we need to deliver this to our country.
I think that's a very, very fair point, and I think there's a lot that needs to happen, and I think that working together with the supply chain is probably one of the priorities, and it comes back to the collaboration point, that you know nobody can do this alone. You have to do it together. You have to make sure your suppliers actually know what is expected of them, but also make sure that they have the tools and the means to actually to deliver on what's expected of them. And I'd like to come back a little bit to this question of tools and means. John, do you think, you know, companies today, the way that they're set up internally, you know, are the skills and the capabilities there? Are all the I mean, obviously we're talking about the methodologies, them maybe not there, but is the rest in place? So, you know, if we had a digitization infrastructure that the data could be exchanged, we had the methodologies to exchange the data consistently, are companies ready to do this? Is the expertise in the company there as well?
Do you mean to get the digitization going, or to actually
deliver on it and to use the data?
To use it. Well, actually, I don't think the biggest problem is the capabilities to use the data. From the business community, there's a long way to go, and there is a long way to go because some of the underpinning technology is still new. I mean, it's obvious that this is going to be based on some kind of distributed ledger technology, blockchains. You know, we need to get unique identity for any sustainability attribute that can have a value in the market. Carbon is spearheading this, but you can have water, you can have biodiversity, you can have, and will have, I think, or we will need to have, I actually think, because you can't fund the transformation that companies need to do that are so, you can't fund that if you can't get revenue running through the value chain related, spearheading that. But we're quite mindful that the system we build up about that, at the end of the day, what we need is an integrated digital data system in the company where you have financial data, but then you have carbon data, then you have water data. You have all the data together in one financial digital system. And I think that's the big thing right now to get working on.
And I think, Michaela, that's a little bit what the European Union is trying to create with the product environmental footprint, which obviously looks at not just carbon, but it looks at other factors, or also the digital product passport, which again looks at that traceability aspect. Maybe to what extent do you feel it's the role of the regulatory environment to put in place these sorts of systems, and what role can business play, and how can business support putting that into place?
Yeah, I agree with what was said. I mean, when we talk about data, it's always at least a three-dimension of challenges that we need to keep in mind. We need to find the data, we need to trust the data, and then we need to exchange the data. And these three challenges, of course, require different solutions, but the solution has to be something, as I was mentioned before, that is agreed along the value chain and in between different value chains. Because one keyword that we haven't mentioned yet, but that for us, at least from European perspective, is essential, is the word interoperability. Yeah. We need, when moving from the old system to the new digital system, not to create new digital silos. So, for example, when we talk about comparing the same data, that means the same things for two companies, this has to be equally valid when we talk about companies working in different value chains. For example, if we're talking about information on steel, that information should be read in the same way by people using the steel for cars, using the steel for construction, using the steel for other appliances. So that is a key element. I also agree that it's not just about carbon. We have to start from carbon for the reason that we know, but we need to build a system that is flexible enough to also accommodate further information down the road. And this is the kind of the logic that we are now deploying in Europe through the recently adopted legislation on sustainability of products and the digital product passport. I think the role for governments and the international institution is not to create the passport to be used, but is to create the level playing fields in terms of standards and protocols, so that then the market can work on that and then create tailored solutions that can be developed by market actors. So basically, our vision, we don't want the passport to be established, but we want a system that can be used to create different forms of passport with different specifications tailored around specific needs, but in a way that the protocols, the standards, the ontology, the semantic is the same for all product groups. And then what needs to be tailored is the specific information that get into the passport, how you manage the access right, the confidentiality, and all the other key issues, but in a system that is flexible and can grow with time.
I like the fact that you've brought into play the word interoperability, and I think the interoperability on the technology side is a core thing. One of the things that often also gets forgotten about is the legal interoperability, so connecting different systems and how that works from a liability perspective if companies are using the data to make decisions on the basis of that data from their supply chain, but also sharing that data on how can you make sure companies are protected, I guess. So maybe let's talk a little bit about the risks or the kind of challenges that these approaches create for companies. Kevin, maybe from your side, where do you see the real risk of such data sharing, or do you see any risk of data sharing, systems, or do you just see opportunities?
I think that by the end, of course, we need to realize that sharing data is not going to make any difference about adding value or not to your brand. I think that from the other hand, I think that it's going to create an opposite situation. We're talking a lot about collaboration, and at least in the beauty sector, we are trying to create what we call the Eco Beauty Consortium. So how we can try to standardize the process that we label our products, considering life cycle assessment. So it's going to be a little bit easier for consumer to understand, because I think that we need to keep in mind that, the first step is just to harmonize, so then we can have fully transparent and we can have accuracy about our emissions. But then let's keep in mind that also we need to face another barrier, and to overcome the second barrier, that is going to be how we can engage the consumer so they can understand what is the data that we are going to disclosure whenever we have our carbon footprint. And I think that, and why I'm telling that, because by graduation I'm a food engineer. And for so many decades, we have disclosure, the nutritional table, And I don't think that consumer yet realize what is the difference. But I think that today, what we have seen is that we are trying to understand, and especially by the commodities, what are the carbon footprint. And I think that we have this huge network across the sector, how we can try to define, let's say, and precise a little bit more the average data that we have in common materials that we use in the sector. So whenever we do this, this is going to be spread and shared by all the actors that has in the sector, because I don't think that is going to create any kind of barriers. By the opposite situation, I think that it's going to create more risk if we decided to create our own silos and do not share data with our own peers. So.
And John, do you see any risks, or do you also kind of agree with what Kevin said?
Yeah, I do agree to a large extent. I think, I mean, when you create data system, there's always some, let's say, operational risks and leaks and things that doesn't work. That's about the integrity of the system, and that's for any system. But at a more, let's say, strategic level, I think the biggest risk is that it's not created, because I mean, we have this in Stora Enso, this clear ambition to be leading this transition and be in the forefront. But again, as I said before, if we're not able to take some of that value add that we create by doing that to the market, we won't be able to fund the transition. And so the risk is that if we don't have this, you just have a lot of claims around you in the market and nobody can see anything. And therefore the edge we're creating by doing everything we're doing will have absolutely no value. So I more see the risk that we don't do it.
Mm-hmm. And do you see I mean, you talked about the value add that this could bring to the market. You know, what are some of the other benefits or values of creating this transparency? I mean, you know, creating more profit or selling greener products, reducing your carbon emissions. I think that's one side to it. Are there other benefits that you think come out of data sharing and transparency? I mean, you know, thinking about, I don't know, reporting, for example, you know, things coming up on the international stage like the ISSB, things like that. What are the use cases where you would employ that data?
Well, yes. I mean, so let's say the company level accounting and accountability and transparency question is important and interesting as well, but it has a lot of different challenges, I think. I mean, one of the challenges that you have this tension maybe between the investor community's wish for standardized data that creates comparability across their portfolios, because they want to understand some value of their exposure. But on the other hand, what really drives a company's market cap from a sustainability point of view is actually whether you have the right transformation strategy, and that's very specific to the to each company. What is actually driving that? That depends on what market you're in. It depends on your asset structure, capital structure, and how you can play with that to do the transformation. And I think these standardized data that you do in ESG reporting, they do not reflect that very well, actually. So I think when you look at it from a company perspective, you can use this to provide what you ask for, and you want to do that. You want to service the financial market, of course, but you also often sit with this idea about, okay, they got this data, they're happy, they make some conclusions, but I actually don't think that the information they got tells them anything about whether we're on the right path to win in a carbon-constrained economy. So, of course, then what do? You present additional tailor-made information, but that's difficult. So there is a tension there that I think is a big, it's a big question, an interesting question that I've engaged myself in with investors. You know, how do we square that circle?
Can I make a comment here? I think that the level of disclosure that we are doing for the market is not, of course, the level of disclosure that we have internally. So basically, in our case, we disclose that the biggest offender that we have in our value chain is related to our packaging. But we are not saying that is related to plastic packaging, glass packaging, and so on. So I think that but in the other hand, whenever we have the relation with our value chain, we have this kind of engagement saying, guys, from our glass suppliers, you're the higher emitters that we have in our value chain. So if you not do anything, probably you are going to shift the type of packaging that we are using. And also it's give
That's a good idea.
pressure
We have
and
some
an
local.
incentive also. It is an incentive also to the supplier to understand, okay, they need to understand that, of course, we are going to compete with their own peers. So I think that it could be an advantage if you use in the right way.
And kind of reflecting a little bit on what you're saying, I mean, the very specific example of packaging and kind of how that relates, obviously, between the two companies. Michele, I'm wondering, what is the interplay also between industry-focused action on this and action across industries, and maybe what is the tension that can create? Because there are industries which are more advanced or heading more in this direction, and others which are kind of not.
Yes, very interesting question. I would also like to start from the conversation between John and Kevin, because it is also something that I was reflecting when you were talking. Because, I mean, we were saying, at least the first part of our conversation was more hinting that the need for transparency is a kind of duty towards consumer, is to allow consumers to take more informed and better, more sustainable choices. And that is for sure true, but probably that is only part of the picture. I mean, we should also keep in mind to what extent this kind of transparency and availability of further data is not also a key element in how you companies manage your value chains and the relations with investors and with the governments. So it's not only about transparency, but it's also about acquiring new and more profound knowledge that then you can use for the eco-design of your products. And this is what Kevin was alluding to. And that is where I think it's also important to try to understand and to reflect what are the how we can design effective sticks and carrots, because this is what we need. I mean, we need to exert some regulatory pressure to give indications in the direction to go, but we need also to create a system to reward the companies that go along that path. It cannot only be about increasing market share through consumers. I think there is a lot of work that can and should be done, for example, in terms of identifying incentives, like we have done, for example, in Europe through the taxonomy work, or creating lead markets for low carbon products, for example. This is something that should be done at the international level. It cannot be something done only in Europe or only in the States or only in Asia. That is where, for example, I think that initiatives like the climate hubs can become very interesting to create the right conditions to establish these multi-market lead markets. And that is also because, I mean, we don't have to be naive in the sense that the moment that you increase transparency, the moment that you have more information on data that you can trust and rely, it's also where you can start discriminate and compare companies. So it's not a zero-sum exercise. It's an exercise where there will be winners and losers. And it is, of course, creates sometimes the political tension, and that maybe have justified why we didn't get there yet. But it's something that we need to address and to guide in terms of the future developments.
Yeah, I really like what you're saying there, because I mean, the transparency piece in itself is such a big challenge, but there's so many other things that we need to unlock as you move towards transparency, because the transparency alone, what's very clear from what the three of you have said, is not really sufficient. You need to put in place the whole machine. Maybe before we kind of go to the floor for some questions, and I would encourage all of you to think if you have any questions for the panel or for Michele online or for the panel here in the room. One last question. I mean, this is all really complex. There's a lot to do, lots of challenges, different people coming together. It's going to take time. So what can companies do in the meantime? What can organizations do in the meantime to advance the decarbonization? Kevin, maybe starting with you.
Yeah, I think that even though that we progress about the disclosure and the accuracy of the data, I think that in the other hand, we need to work in parallel because we are still lacking with some technologies. And of course, to accelerate not only the development, but also the scale up of those solutions, we need to work in a collaborative way. Otherwise, we are not going to figure out some solutions that allowed us to reduce our carbon footprint by the time that we have left. So.
Yeah, in a certain sense, there is no meantime because this is what we all should be on. So we're on it. So it's not in the meantime. It's not waiting for something. It's creating something. So it's a more. But I know what you mean. I mean, what can we do right now? Where are we in the process? And there's a lot. There's a lot to unlock. And of course, we're talking about single consumers. And there's one big issue about that. Eventually, they can get this transparency of the product, but can they interpret it? Do they understand it? So there's some maturation of consumers as well. Given we're talking also in the context of the public sector, and we have the question about everything progressive that Europe is doing, also in terms of footprint, which I think is helping. There is just one thing, and I think everybody's saying, so it's not very original, but I just think it's such an important thing from the public side, and that's the procurement muscle of the public sector, because there you have, of course, concentrated spending power, and you have a different level. You have the opportunity to have a different level of knowledge and understanding the data that the single consumer maybe that has not really read him or herself into this. You have that. So I think that's an opportunity that is underutilized massively. And so if we have this in the meantime, let's get all public procurement focused on low carbon products and sustainable products immediately. I would say that I think there's really no excuse for that.
Michele, do you have anything to add from your side? What can we do now?
Yeah, no, I want to reply to John. There is one specific reason, and this is again back to the chicken and egg situation. There is one specific reason why green public procurement has not been used as wide as we would love. And because when you speak to procurers in member states, they tell you that they're not doing it because they are not agreed methodologies and the data that they receive is not reliable. So, we are going in circles. If we don't have the data and the methodology, we cannot do the procurement. If we don't do the procurement, we will not have the products and the data. From our perspective, we are trying to push as much as possible in that direction, to the extent that, for example, in the new regulation that I was mentioning before on the eco-design for sustainable products, we have introduced a specific requirement on mandatory green public procurements and the possibility to link those to the performance, the environmental performance of products. So basically, for the products that will be regulated when it is relevant and appropriate, we will define classes of environmental performance, maybe based on carbon footprint, maybe based on other footprints or on other environmental aspects. And then we will be able to link those classes of performance to mandatory GPP criteria that then will be used at European and member states level. We think that is a very powerful leverage and driver that we are now bringing into the legal framework. And we hope that this will lead to some important changes.
John, I can see you nodding. You're very happy about that, clearly.
No, absolutely. And I, of course, I know the barriers there and the chicken and egg. And I think it goes back to what I was trying to say with my really first intervention about, where's the big... I think to break this chicken and egg thing, I think the most important thing is that we massively invest in the data system. Yeah. It is what can break this stalemate. So that's what we should get together around.
Well, I think that's a great point to end on, and to hand over to the floor for some questions. So, yeah, please, if you have any questions for the panel, now is the time. A rare occurrence. Don't be shy. Dominic, I think you have a question. Elisa, could you just...
Thank you. It's just so interesting to kind of hear the discussion. This is a global challenge, not just a European Union challenge. It's fantastic to have the perspective of Natura, headquartered in Sao Paulo and such. But how do you see this? Because there are different markets and different elements of not only access to data, but let's say competition. You mentioned, sir, from the Commission, about policy. For example, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, where this sort of methodology could come into play. But is it that Europe can drive this and the rest of the global market follows, or it has to be a kind of a universal effort? Because I imagine that's just to add to the complexity of the challenge. I'd just be interested in those perspectives, a bit more international, particularly emerging economies, developing countries take on this. Thank you.
Yeah, as I mentioned in one of my previous replies, I think we need international agreements. It cannot be only Europe pushing the bar high and the others to follow. That may work in the short term, but it's not a long-term solution. Might lead to all sort of trade tensions and things that are not useful in order to address the challenges that we have. So yes, I mean the carbon border adjustment mechanism is a typical example where we step in as a way to increase the level playing field, but also as a way to show to other administrations that is a possible way forward. And indeed, this is creating a positive momentum around that, because we are seeing an increased interest of other governments outside Europe to also work in that direction. So we think, as I mentioned before, that coalitions of the Willings, Climate Club, and these kind of initiatives and work at standardization level is essential to address these challenges in a way that is more of an international nature. At the same time, I don't think we have the possibility to wait until there is the perfect agreement before taking actions. There are emergencies, there are climate emergencies, there are other environmental emergencies that require. It's a duty for us as policymakers to take steps, even if there is not an international agreement. But we still prefer and would love to have international agreements to base our actions upon.
And I think.
No, I'm just echoing that. I think we had a really interesting session yesterday here by launching the action agenda. Also talking about, we had Peter Löfgren that's now working on multilateralism, which is, we know in crisis. It's this art of walking on two legs. I mean, we need to have action, although we don't have the perfect global system. But I think it's important that we also do not stop working on the longer perspective, that we can have a global system that's really conducive to this. So I think it's just a really important point, Dominic, that we do not give up on the global level. When we have WTO is stalled, but it needs to be set in motion again at some point. And the environmental, is it Article 31 or something in there? We need to work on that.
And I think also, to some extent, business has a role in driving that international action and that globalization. I mean, you come from different geographies, here on the panel. We work a lot with companies, for example, in Japan as well, who are trying to tackle some of these topics and trying to bring the business community together as well, globally, and not trying to take this one very Europe-centric view or US-centric view. I think that's also part of the part of it. Maybe before we hand over back to Dominic for some. Oh, sorry, there's another question in the audience just up here.
Thank you so much for a really interesting discussion. My name is Corley Pretorius. I work with UNEP WCMC and I operate mainly in the biodiversity space. And I'm really keen to get a whole lot of housekeeping going in the biodiversity data space. But I'm really interested in the comment you made around the legal interoperability, because this is one of the questions that we're looking at, because governments like to use their own data, national data, and the national data is going to be the part of what comes into play if you look also to compliance at the national level. So my question is, how much do you as companies rely on national data, and how much do you just draw from global data, and where's the meeting point between the availability of national data and the complementarity of global data? we're interested also in building capacity of governments to make the data available. So that's a little bit behind my question, yeah.
Yeah, I can go first. So I think that it's going to be a mixture. Whenever you have the national data, I think that if we have the same framework that we establish, it will reflect probably some local conditions that we have. I can give you probably the best example is ethanol in Brazil is made from sugar cane, and we go to Europe is beetroot, and you go to the US corn. So depending on the regions also, we need to count about this regional or national database. I think that in the other hand, whenever you have a lack about the data, of course, then you need to go to a global data. So probably in the end, it's going to be always a mixture.
Yeah, it's a good question, and we happen to be in dialogue with you about this, and I think it's a difficult question. It's really early days, but it's really important on biodiversity as well that we get the data question solved. It's a big mix of everything right now, and it's not easy to navigate. I think at the end, maybe, I mean, over time, the biodiversity data also needs to be digitized and be unique. And I think that will solve some of it. But of course, that's a little bit into the future. Our focus right now is, I mean, we own a lot of forest. So we are starting to try to digitize or build digital twins of the forest, including the biodiversity. So we have that, but that's just one part of our biodiversity interlinkages in the value chain, of course, but a big one that we operate ourselves. But really good question. I don't think we have more answers right now.
Sorry, just to complement a little bit on the biodiversity side, I think that probably we need to go even to a deep level that is going to be a local level, not a national level. Because we are applying, for instance, and we have this work about science-based target network, and we are trying to apply the methodology in the tropical rainforest in Brazil. We are talking about the same country, we are talking about the same biome, but we selected 3 areas, and the results were totally different. So by the end, when we are talking about biodiversity, probably we need to go even to a deeper level.
Yeah, thank you also from my side. I also think it's a great question, and in a way, it's a great endpoint for us to really think. You know, we're talking about transparency here. We're focusing on carbon because it's the topic that's really, you know, kind of everywhere. But actually, the work that's being done here and the transparency that can be created by putting in place methodologies, but also digital infrastructures, that is a baseline to look at everything else, and it has to be seen as that and within the context of everything else, because we need transparency in everything, not just carbon. So thank you very much for bringing that up. I think that's a great point to end us on. I'd like to thank our panel here today for being with us and sharing your very valuable and great insights. I'll hand back over to Dominic to close us off with some key takeaways, but let's give the panel a big round of applause.
Oops. So I told you it'd be interesting, didn't I? For those of you kind of into it, that's probably raised 25 more questions. Kind of, I didn't realize how complicated this is going to be, and that's the point. That's the point. I'd just like to honor, our business members here, Stora Enso, Natura. There's how many have we got overall, Anna, in this initiative now, alongside these champions?
60.
60. So you've got 60 leading companies trying to figure this out, and the invitation is really there to those in the network beyond who are already involved in that ecosystem. If there are kind of data pools, if there are challenges or issues, please do kind of join this. It's called the Partnership for Accelerating Carbon Transparency, but I'm beginning to think that the C could be worked on in terms of partnership for accelerating collaborative transparency or even competitive transparency, because that sort of gives us the market sharpness for what we need. Because there is this really interesting balance between what we need to be able to share, as we heard from the financial community or for our policymakers, versus how do we kind of differentiate market and competitiveness and product and differentiation. And sometimes when you're not in the business space, you don't think like that. You think we just need the kind of ESG information, but it's much more complicated. And it's the market that's going to drive the innovation and the growth and the jobs and the skills and the unicorns of tomorrow. So that young lady in Nigeria will be the Natura or the Stora Enso of the future, driving this kind of agenda. So thank you very much for the engagement here. I'm sure our colleagues from the panel, unfortunately perhaps not virtually, would be delighted to take any kind of informal questions and things. Partnership for Accelerating Carbon Transparency. Anna leading the charge on this at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's an open invitation to please get engaged, because it's, as I said at the beginning, it's such an important piece of a delivery jigsaw. And it sometimes feels like we're so far in, but so far away from where we need to get to, and we just don't have the time. So we've got to get on it. So thank you very much. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and thank you, Anna, and thank you, panelists, for a wonderful, wonderful discussion. Thank you all.